All right, migrating from Magento 1 to Magento 2 like a pro. We're hoping that will help you do that. This is a very hot topic, so thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you'll find this useful. I'm Noelle Darlington. I'm a project manager in the Expert Consulting Group, also known as ECG. And with me, Gordon Noppy, who is a business solutions architect. Gordon is based out of Ireland, and I am based out of the Los Angeles office. Okay, soup to nuts. What is soup to nuts? Also known as A to Z, or stem to stern, or cradle to grave. These are all expressions that mean from beginning to end. And this is the general approach that ECG likes to take with migrations, and is the focus of this presentation. So we take a holistic view, and we like to start with analyzing what you have, and then taking you all the way to the end to finally deploying at the end. The phases of approach, 7 main buckets, then we label them as analysis, strategy, development, QA, staging cutover, UAT, and finally production cutover. Gordon and I are going to take turns addressing each, so we'll hand it off to talk about each topic as we go through. So if you'll note, development is but one of the tasks, and so we're going to spend a lot of time up front analyzing what we have to get you to the end and production cutover. And we like to think that if you can nail all 7 of these, you should be really well set up for success. Very first one is analysis. So let's analyze what we have. So some would dive in and just say, give me the code, run it through the tool, start fixing and testing. And we would recommend that you actually take a slower approach and really start with code audit, then requirements, then looking at the theme, then looking at your test documentation. And these are the 4 things that will lead into the strategy phase that Gordon is going to discuss. So I'm going to dive into each one in detail. Very first one being the code audit. So we recommend that you become really familiar with the code in each of these 6 components. So custom modules, third-party extensions, dependencies between modules and extensions, unused modules, JavaScript functionality, and business logic and templates. So is this a new site for you to migrate, or have you been working on it for years? Even if you've been working on it for years, chances are there's some code that was written 2 years ago, 6 months ago, something that you're probably not intimately familiar with, or maybe one of your other developers worked on that code, so you don't know all the details. So look at all of it, become very familiar with it, especially the custom modules. Extensions. If you're migrating to M2, do the extensions that you're using in M1 exist in M2? Are they ready? And then something that Gordon and I got into when we did the merchant beta program, we found that an extension provider said they had an M2 version, but they didn't have all the same features as the M1. So make sure that not only it exists, but that it also has the same features that you need. Dependencies between modules and extensions. So this little diagram kind of one example of how you can have lots of different things going on. One module needs another one, and it influences the order in which you migrate. So you can't migrate a module until all of its dependencies are migrated as well, so you should become really familiar with what those are. Unused modules, pretty straightforward. If there's something you're not using, there might not be any point in migrating it, or maybe you should be using it and you're not using it, so you should become familiar with what that is as well. JavaScript functionality. JavaScript is not going to get migrated with the tools, so you're going to need to figure out how you're going to port that over. And then business logic and templates. Usually, we recommend that you don't have logic and templates. You keep those in custom modules. So if you can migrate them to a custom module, but in any case, you need to have a plan for how you're going to migrate those. So now once you're familiar with the code and you know everything about it, what you need, what you don't need, extensions, ECG's approach is to fix the code before you migrate it. Because if you have less than perfect code in your M1 version, the tools don't magically fix everything and give you a perfect solution at the end, right? Bad code in, when you migrate it, will be the same bad or less than perfect code. So it's ideally if you can fit the time in, and it's worth it because it'll ensure easier upgrades, easier maintenance. So if you can do that, that's highly recommended. The next bucket is requirements. And you might think, what do you mean requirements? We're migrating from M1 to M2. We want the same site that we had before. And That's the requirement, right? What we found, not so much the case, not always the case. It could be that you have customizations in your M1 version that can now be replaced with native. So what is your approach going to be for that? Or are you even still using that customization? Is it unused? There's not a whole lot of point in migrating something that you're not going to use. Or maybe you have a customization that you've changed and you've put some band-aids on it and you've done so many things that you're not even really sure what the original requirement was. So can you start fresh? Is it something that was so convoluted that now you have the chance that you can go through and clean it up? Next one might seem very simplistic, but just mapping out the M1 features that you used and then mapping out the M2 features that you want to use makes it really easy and clean so you know what you had before and what you're going to do. So were you using RMA? Were you using wish lists? Loyalty program, gift cards? Were you using them before and you want to keep using them, or you don't want to use them anymore? So just having that really simple list can help you have a much clearer picture of what you need to do in the migration. Desktop versus mobile. It's very rare that the desktop site is identical to the mobile site. Maybe you want to show different content on mobile. Maybe you want to show less to make it easier for conversion. Whatever those things are, you should know what the merchant is going to want to do. And maybe you weren't using responsive. You were using a separate mobile site from a third party. Now you can get rid of that because you want to go responsive. So all things that you should be considering when you're doing a migration. Testing, of course, how are you going to test it? Requirements should be defined so that the testers know what to test. They're going to be, maybe your QA team has never worked on this site before, so they're not going to know that this customization works this way or needs to be tested in such a way. So if you have those requirements documented, it's going to be a lot easier for them to test it. And finally, deployment tools. It's going to be changing in M2, so you're going to want to take a look at how you're going to be doing that in M2. A gotcha that Gordon and I ran into in one of our merchant beta participants was they had no documented requirements, or very few. And so when we asked them, how are you going to test them, there was silence. And so we went through with them on the phone, in-person meetings, and we looked at all of their customizations. We looked at all the requirements that, some were documented loosely for the more recent things that they had done, but something they'd done 2 years ago, there was nothing written for it. So they actually spent time on the phone with Gordon. He pointed out all the things that were missing, and they took the time to write out everything that we needed, and it really helped make a difference for the project. The next thing, the theme, the beautiful theme, how your site looks, what everyone generally sees when they go to your site, right? What are the requirements? Are you going to do a new theme? Some merchants want to take advantage of, while you're going through this process, while you're redoing so much of this code, maybe you want to redesign some of it while you're at it. Or maybe you want to go responsive because you weren't before. So you should have a plan for how you're going to approach that. And as I mentioned earlier, business logic in templates, if it's in there, you probably want to remove some of that. It can be hidden in templates and skins in an unorganized way, and it's better to clean that up so you can handle it in M2. Front-end theming in Magento 2 is completely different and not currently included in the migration tools. So a new theme should be developed to incorporate some of M2's new front-end techniques. And then test documentation. Starting early is so key here. You don't want to start thinking about testing when you get to development because you might end up waiting for testing by the time you're done for development. And end-to-end testing, you need to plan for. It's very different from functional and unit testing. If you think about it, when was the last time you had to test the entire site from front to beginning? The front end, the back end, marketing, merchandising, customer service. Lots of different things are going to be changing in the migration. So you want to make sure that you have a plan who's going to test it and how. And we'll talk about more QA a little bit later. Written documentation gap analysis. You want to look at test cases and test scenarios that you have and map those to requirements to see where the gaps are so that you can write the test cases that you need to match each requirement. We recently did a project that had no test cases whatsoever. And this client realized within 2 weeks of us starting the project that this was going to be a very key area for a brand new, they wanted to redo the theme, they wanted to migrate, they wanted to incorporate lots of new things. So testing was going to be a huge thing for them, and they had a lot of customizations. So they actually hired a QA resource full-time, started right in the beginning, and started looking through the requirements that we had helped them create, and started doing QA scenarios for everything, which made a really big difference. And so now, hopefully, you've done your code audit, your code fixing, you have your requirements, you know what you're doing with your theme, you have your test documentation, and those are all the components that you need for strategy. And now that you know the what, you can now start thinking about the how. And this is where I'm going to hand it over to Gordon so he can start talking about strategy.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Noel. Thank you, everyone. So yes, strategy. This is the output, or what you take from that analysis phase. You now are going to be creating your approach for doing the migration. So when we take this strategies, we basically group them into 3 major sections. We're talking about code, data, and operations, right? So these are written documents, whether it's wiki pages, whether it's Word docs, whatever your team uses to share information. These strategies are critical for providing your team with a reference point that they'll be able to use throughout the life cycle of the project. It's like Noel covered in new features. The new features strategy is where you're going to document the things that are, they're new in Magento 2, so that it's brand new in your whole implementation, or maybe it's just new to you. Maybe you're on Community Edition and going to M2EE, so there's a whole bunch of enterprise features that you'll be using. Perhaps you're returning to native, right? So in the beta program, we know with the Magento 2's approach, you've got Ajax add to cart, color swatching, visual merchandiser, a lot of these features built in that your site may not have on M1, or you may be using a third-party extension for. So can you get rid of them? But overall, when you're talking about new features and capabilities of Magento, demo is so important. So getting this in front of your business users and have them approve and understand what this new feature is going to be is critical so that you can be sure it matches what your requirements are. Third-party extensions, Noel covered this a bit, just run through it quickly. This is really just inventorying these things. Are you going to remove them? Are you going to upgrade them? What version are you going to? Is it ready? Does it do everything it was supposed to do? But the custom modules, right? So you've got those new features, you've got those third-party extensions, but this is what makes your site your site. This is your custom business logic. So here we need to create a solid plan for each one of the extensions that are in your code base. Are we going to be removing it again? Are we going to migrate it in full? Or are we going to re-architect it, right? So when you're looking at how you approached a solution or a problem in Magento 1, perhaps you think you should consolidate some of these extensions or divide them up. If you've looked at your code base and you've got that underscore catalog module, what does that thing do? Can you possibly split that out into discrete features that are easily understandable? Or are you going to just take an entirely different approach? But the point is, you create a plan for each one of these extensions. We get past the code, we get to theming. As we've seen in earlier presentations, we know that the front-end layer is completely different in Magento 2. You've got those familiar PHTML files, but CSS and JavaScript are completely different with less and require.js. What's your responsive foundation? So Magento 2 ships with the blank theme and the Luma theme. Which one are you going to be based off of? Are you a single store that has a simple theme that you just need one theme? That's pretty straightforward. But are you a big global multinational and you have many brands to support? You need to localize your theme. What's your approach going to be? As you saw, there's theme inheritance that can be defined. And so what's your approach going to be? As well, of course, when we're talking theming, we need to consider these personal devices. What's your mobile strategy? How does it impact your theming strategy? What's your responsiveness? These kind of things. Next, we get into those integrations. Integrations, we know these evolve over time. You've got that landscape diagram. Is it up to date? Let's list every one of our integrations, call out what's being passed back and forth, what data types, what's their integration type, is this API-driven, FTP, that kind of thing. Again, we're going to remove it, migrate it, re-architect it. Are you going to leverage some of Magento 2's new API-driven or RabbitMQ-based approach, right? This could entirely change the way you want to integrate your third-party components. information, right? So this is a bigger topic. This is where we're talking about the database, the media, the design elements that might be in your database. What's your plan for these? If you don't know already, Magento has produced a data migration tool for you. This is on GitHub. This is public and open source. It supports Community Edition 1.6 and Enterprise Edition 1.11 to migrate you to Magento 2. I think it's a very useful feature, but please check that out. But not only when you are using that migration tool, you now need to understand what's there, how much data is it, how long is it going to take to migrate? Do you need to clean up certain tables, like some of your log tables or something? Trim the size of that database down so that you know what that migration process is going to be. What's that clear plan? So you've got for launch day, you know exactly how long it's going to take. You know it's going to take 2 hours to do these steps. It's very critical to practice throughout your development of your project, of your site. One gotcha on the data migration tool that I would point out, and especially when it comes to architecture of your modules, is that it is a data migration tool. It doesn't migrate your schema. So if you're looking at an extension that you built that defines a couple of tables and maybe adds a couple of columns, that definition isn't moved by the tool. The tool just migrates the data. So if you're considering how to implement your customization in Magento 2, your Magento 1 extension might have done 1 install script and then 38 upgrade scripts to result in the final schema that exists on that site. So maybe you're going to need to consolidate that for your M2 extension. When it installs its schema, it does it in one clear insert of all your new schema. As we've covered before, infrastructure, we know the completely new technology stack. What are the impacts to you? Do you need to include those third-party services like Varnish, Redis, Elasticsearch? What impacts do they have on your overall architecture? What does it do to your deployment process? As we know with Magento 2, you need to have one, right? You need to have a real build process that goes through materialization of files, compiling. This could impact your deployment. Infrastructure as a whole, ECG is working on a white paper that gives our recommendations on what you should do to configure these services, as was called out in the previous presentation if you saw recommendations about Apache, Nginx, PHP. Not only those infrastructures and how they're running, but then what are they, right? Are they the dev environment stage, QA, production? Define what your environments are going to be. Do you have an existing M1 site that you're going to need to support during this migration? What are the impacts? Were you planning on reusing some of that hardware or not? You know, this is the plan that shows what you're going to do with it. Are you moving to the cloud? Are you making big picture decisions like your developer's environment? Are you going to use this Docker thing you've heard about? You know, what can you do possibly? The environments plan is really good for setting up your team for success. Finally, testing strategy. We know Noel detailed requirements and testing on requirements, but what I'm referring to here is also unit testing, integration testing, functional testing. What Magento 2 ships with is a TDD-driven approach that are you going to continue to run those tests? Hopefully you are. What does it mean? Do you have a continuous integration process? How does it factor in? And then, of course, for your custom code that you're going to develop, what are your testing requirements for your development team? They need to be fully covered by unit tests, these kind of things. Define these processes. Lastly, we've got business processes. So this one is, I think, the one that's probably always going to be missed unless you're right on top of your game, so please absorb this. Business processes could mean anything, really two different things. It could be overall organizational business process, like your fulfillment isn't going through a certain route, certain steps are being reordered. That's one type of change to a business process. The other one, though, is like your merchant experience. As you've seen already from Magento 2, the admin is completely different. There's a lot of improvements that have been made there. People's roles like merchandisers or order management can be very impacted. So what are the tools that they're going to be able to take advantage of? How is their daily job changing? And it'll be helpful to produce this for them. Okay, so we did all that strategy work. Time to work on the code. I'm not going to cover that. After this presentation, we've got Sergey Shimko talking about our code migration tools. This is an open source tool. It's available on GitHub. Not only do we talk about the tool, and Sergey will talk about the tool, but also what your development approach should be when using the tool. So how you would address a project using this type of thing. So stay tuned for Sergey. after this presentation. Okay, I'll hand it back over to Noelle for some QA stuff.
Thank you. QA, okay. Maybe often overlooked until you're at QA and you need to start testing. But as I mentioned, please start soon. It makes a huge difference when you get to this stage. So the very first step is your test plan. Define it. Ideally, don't just tell your QA people, all right, you're testing on, May 5th. You need to have a plan to address all of these things. Who's going to be testing it and how? So development testing, unit testing, automated testing. I know your code that you write is beautiful and perfect, but you probably should be testing it before you merge it. As great as you developers are, it's a good idea to take a look at it before it's merged to mainline. So how are the developers going to be testing their work? QA team, who is it going to be, and when are they going to be required to start testing? UAT plans, working with the client, when, what, who, how long is it going to take? Any tools you're going to be using for testing, ticketing tools, spreadsheets, if you're using Selenium or some other tool that helps automate that. And then communication, how our team is going to know when to test, who's going to be notified, and how. And then the workflow, when something is fixed, what process is going to be used to deploy it and to validate it. So all those things should go into your test plan. And then you have your test environment where you're going to define where is it going to be QA'd and staging the flow of fixes from one environment to the next, dev server, QA server, make sure your changes aren't getting overwritten. I'm sure everyone's encountered that at some point where something gets deployed. It was working yesterday, it's not working today. What happened? Try and figure that out up front so that you don't have to deal with that and lose precious time. For test cases, the inputs, ideally this is where those requirements that you defined probably several months ago are going to come in handy. And then any UAT cases that the client has, they might have some from, they might not have everything, they probably won't have everything, but they'll have something from the last few changes that were deployed and that they looked at. So anything the client can give you is a huge help here. And then for outputs, you're going to take your test cases and then create what we call a requirements to test case matrix. So here are all the requirements. Do I have a test case for each one? And then look for gaps and make sure that you can fill those gaps as soon as possible. Leveraging what the client has is huge, and then you want to involve as many of the client's different business units as you can. So the merchandisers, the people that are uploading things, the people that are, support, anything that they're going to have to be using, all of them need to be involved at some point. So helping, if they don't know how to do that, then help guide them how to do that. And a little bit more on UAT here. So you have whatever client's UAT test cases that they had, and then the output is going to be any testing issues and test results. So they're going to be looking at integration testing and end-to-end systems testing. So between Magento and each third-party system, OMS, ERP, shipping, whatever other systems the client has, wherever data is passed to an external system that then processes it, sends it back to Magento, needs to be tested. Regression testing, so making sure that nothing broke when you fix something else. UAT is bringing in all your admins, your merchandiser support, et cetera, everything. Everyone's going to come in and take a look. Deployment testing, which is really critical. You want to make sure you've practiced deployment a few times so that when it's time to actually flip the switch, nothing breaks. If something happens, you know how to handle it, and that ties into recovery. So make sure that there's a rollback plan for anything that might go wrong. And this is a sample of UAT matrix that a client can use that clearly shows, you can break it out into catalog, customer, sales, returns. Each group can be testing their own separate thing, and then quickly mark out, what passed, what failed, can't test, ready to be retested, and then it quickly shows, how far along you are, and this is very useful for the client so that they know where they're going. Hopefully they're not just saying, hey, everybody in the organization, bang on the site and let us know what you find. It's helpful for finding little bugs, little nits, but it's not going to cover all the different detailed areas that should be covered when you're doing this. So really helpful to guide the clients in how to do this and step by step. And now you are ready to cut over. So Gordon is going to talk to you about some of those technical steps.
Right. So Cutover, that's the big fun event, right? Going to production or of course, your first time going to staging. But going to staging is your first practice, right? So that at least when you go from your dev environment, you start producing that staging environment, I would recommend treating it as a simulated launch. It's one of many of your practices that you can do. But key to our recommendations here is to have a cutover list. Right? So this is a complete spreadsheet, an online doc, whatever you need to do to collaborate, but it's key to point out, the orders of the operation, what's dependent on what other tasks, what's the description, who's responsible for it, and what's its status. This list can then be worked on iteratively. You can practice it. You can do some dry runs. This is just key to a successful cutover. And I just think it's very important, especially not only just to have a successful cutover, but also a understanding of the time, the expectation of how long it's going to take, so that you can set the right expectations across your business units.
The reason why Gordon and I are here today is because we were intimately involved in the merchant beta program, which kicked off July of last year, and there were about 10, 12 merchants that were selected along with partners to get a very first glimpse at Magento 2 code and be the first to implement it. So Gordon and I were involved on every single one of those projects, dealing with, some were migrating from M1, some were on CE, some were brand new sites, and all the things that they encountered working with M2, the questions that came up, the extensions that we uncovered, and that was a big hurdle that we had to get through where, yes, we thought, great, we have an M2 extension, and we delivered it to them, and they said only half the features are there. Okay, we went back to the extension provider and worked through some of that. So we learned a lot from that process. As a result, we've kind of helped define what the ECG migration process should be, and found that if you go through all of these things in detail and you spend the time up front, kind of like measure twice, cut once, usually you just want to start developers. I get it, developers just want to start developing. But if you take the more methodical approach and sort of spend that extra time up front, you'll find that at the end, once you get to the migration and testing, everything is going to go a lot smoother. So those were our lessons learned.
Thank you, guys.